Greetings, Gov 636 colleagues. I am going to speak to you on change and instability in the House of Representatives. Specifically, going to take a look at the House in a Time of Crisis, Economic Turmoil, and Partisan Upheaval by Lawrence C. Dodd and Bruce Oppenheimer. Looking at kind of their overall argument and then getting to specifics of the Congresses, just a brief historical background on Congress, and then examine the shifts in Congress from 1994 onward and what sort of political concepts have underlined these shifts in control of the House. Really what has occurred, and their main argument is really the political polarization of the electorate coupled with state level partisan gerrymandering really creates a highly contested, divided House of Representatives. Essentially, many seats are going to be safe, meaning you're not going to see one side gain a huge advantage over the other, and it becomes much more national in nature for congressional elections. So really the only consistent feature of the House since 1994 has been changed. You look at the Republicans swept to control in 94, you had the Gingrich era through 98, then he resigns, you have the Hastert years, there's disillusion with the Republicans, it goes back to the Democrats in 2006, and then the Democrats have their run at it, and in 2010, they lose control to Republicans. So they're examining why we're in this current period where change is really the only dominant feature in regards to the House and who controls that body. And really, a lot of this goes back to, and what this has resulted in is party leaders not focusing on policy, but more or less the electoral consequences of their actions and how that will affect whether they hold on to power or whether they fall to or regain power. So the historical background, he briefly talks about some House reforms in 1910 that ended the strong control of the speakership and really ends in the era of committee government. What happens with these reforms is committee chairs wield considerable power, and the speaker and other party leaders are generally less powerful, less able to hold control over these party leaders. So the committee chairs become very, very important to getting things done. However, the legislative acts of the civil rights movement, as well as internal changes that made committee chairs accountable to party, caused significant changes to the composition of the House. And what you see is the parties begin to polarize. The conservative factions, which had dominated the committees that were controlled by Democrats, particularly Southern conservative Democrats, begin to fall away as the party becomes more liberal. And then the Republicans become a more conservative party as well, and the parties start to split in the 60s, 70s. Certainly under the Tip O'Neill era, they begin to move that way. And then you hit the historic election of 1994, where it all comes to a head. So looking at the Republican breakthrough in 1994. So following these elections, the Republicans regained control of the House for the first time since 1952. Gingrich and the Republicans make some reforms that essentially reestablish a strong leadership. Seniority is no longer the deciding rule in who gets committee chairmanships. It's really subject to approval by the Speaker and the party leaders. And committee chairs are limited to 3 terms. Previously, committee chairs served for quite a long time, establishing and accruing much power to themselves. Now this practice fades away, meaning party loyalty and the speakership are more important in determining what happens as far as policy and who gets these chairmanships. And really, the second thing to look at, the Republicans' contract with America really embodies an ideological challenge to liberalism and big government thinking. And Gingrich is going to spend the first 2 years as Speaker challenging Bill Clinton and the Democrats head on and in a very open way. The fall of Gingrich really happens over 2 things. In his first term as Speaker, he has a confrontation with Clinton over the budget that ends in 2 government shutdowns in which Gingrich and the Republicans get blamed for the shutdown. Clinton wins re-election, and the Republicans begin to have to moderate their policy stances if they're going to maintain their majority. They lose seats in the 96 election, but hold on to the majority. In 98, they were supposed to win, but Gingrich pushed for impeachment of Clinton, which he did get. But the electorate responded, and their majority in Congress becomes very narrow to the point that it's predicted that the Republicans will lose control of the House in 2000 and 2002. Dennis Hastert replaces Gingrich as Speaker of the House. He's not nearly a national policy leadership guy, not nearly as ideologically stringent as Gingrich, and not as confrontational. This helps them because in 2000 and 2002, despite predictions of losing seats to the Democrats and losing their majority status, they're able to expand their majority ultimately in 2002. But a lot of this can be attributed to President Bush's successes in the war on terror. However, the Republicans get mired in the 109th Congress of not being able to really craft any meaningful policy despite resounding victories in the 2004 election, and Bush's disapproval rating due to the failures in Iraq and the questions surrounding the U.S. entry into the Iraq War in the first place lead to a battered president, and the Republicans take the brunt of that, and the Republicans fall to the minority status in 2006. So the return of the Democrats, you have Speaker Pelosi is elected, and they're really capitalizing on the policy failings of Republicans, the presidential disapproval, the House scandals. What they did was they recruited conservative and moderate Democrats to unseat unpopular Republican incumbents. And a lot of this goes back to a number of things. You had certainly scandals going on, but also the Republicans were seen as out of touch, particularly for a party that talked about fiscal restraint in not raising taxes. Certainly they did cut taxes, but fiscal restraint was a big one, where they passed the Medicaid prescription bill and engaged in a lot of spending on the Iraq War. They were not seen as the fiscal conservatives as they once were. And so the Democrats exploit that and unseat a lot of unpopular Republican incumbents with these conservative moderate Democrats. The Democrats, however, it makes their party not as homogenous. It's going to be a little hard to navigate as their party is a liberal party, but now they have all these conservative and moderate members. So how are they going to navigate this new political landscape? And there was some belief that they would not be in the majority in 2008. The 2006 was a blip on the radar. However, due to the economy and the Great Recession, they are able to pass key legislation to bail out the economy with the assistance of President Bush, and it leads to their maintaining their majority in 2008. So you have unified Democrat-controlled government in 2008. The presidents control the presidency and Congress for the first time since 1993. However, governing from the center would prove difficult for the Democrats. You have President Obama, who's a very stringent, ideologically liberal candidate with many activist agenda items, as well as a generally liberal body. It's going to be very hard for them to please their conservative and moderate members on what to do. The 111th Congress would engage in one of the most activist domestic programs in American history. You had a number of things from the bailouts of the auto industry, Dodd-Frank finance and credit reform, the Recovery Act of 2009, which was a $787 billion stimulus package, as well as the wildly unpopular Affordable Care Act is passed. Despite these policy gains, they steered too far to the left. So what happens is, as this is going on, you have the Tea Party rise up, and we enter into the Tea Party era. Despite their successes, really what happens is many people that are suffering and struggling in this economic downturn are wondering why the people who caused the recession and really begin to really see the government as being the cause of the recession, why are we spending money bailing out companies that made mistakes? Why is the American electorate being held responsible for that or on the hook for that? And really that an activist government was the cause of it. So you see the rise of this Tea Party movement. So it's born out of these frustrated anti-tax, anti-government voters. The Tea Party label also allowed new Republicans and conservatives to distance themselves from the unpopularity of George Bush and to create a new path for themselves. What happens is in 2010, the Republicans surged to control the House following the 2000 midterms. So a few key items that Dodd and Oppenheimer point out that really the 2010 election shows and will define kind of the House and things moving forward are a number of things. First, parties really are now running national campaigns and not individual campaigns. Generally, shifts occur when they can tie national issues across the board to congressional elections. As you saw in 2006, the unpopularity of Bush and the Iraq War, the Democrats were able to exploit that and apply it across the board to House races and won control of the House. Republicans took the unpopularity of the Affordable Care Act and stimulus spending and were able to apply that and win election in 2010. Also, the parties have become more politically homogenized. It's very, once they get into power, there's not a lot of moderation. The Republicans are conservative, the Democrats are liberal. Most seats are also safe in Congress because of partisan gerrymandering. So only about 10 to 15% of seats in a particular midterm or congressional election are going to affect the shift in balance. Winning the national vote no longer results in what was called a seat bonus. So if a party won 55% of the national vote in Congress, they could expect to hold anywhere between 57 and 59% of the seats in Congress. Now that doesn't hold up. It's almost within 1%, if not less. In fact, the Republicans enjoy an advantage where they don't have to win the pop national vote to hold a majority of seats in Congress. When a party's majority expands, it becomes vulnerable to losing its majority. Again, this goes back to most seats being safe. So there's only so many seats at play, and these seats are moderate districts. And as their majority expands, the party typically moves towards one end of the political spectrum. So they make those moderate seats vulnerable. They have to hold seats that may have been in Democrat hands when they won them. They're not reliable seats for those parties. So they become more vulnerable as they get larger. Moderates really become the political casualties whenever the House changes hands. You look at 2010, many of the moderate and conservative Democrats that swept the Democrat Party to control the Congress in 2006 lost their seats in 2010. And then Republicans have come to dominate the South, while Democrats have come to dominate the Northeast and urban areas of the country. You're really seeing more regionalization affect the composition in Congress. And then policymaking really is now a game of weighing electoral consequences. Party leaders have to consider what the impact will be on elections of the particular policy they're pursuing. It's no longer pursuing policy goals for their own benefit for what it's best. It's considering what the electoral consequences will be. So looking at the Boehner speakership when he comes into power in 2010, he's elected and he faced two options on how to proceed in the House. First, he could hold hostage the political process and bend the Democrats to President Obama and the Republican will. The second thing he could have done was embrace bipartisanship, compromise, and cooperation. What ends up happening is the influence of the Tea Party forces his hand. They have to focus on this strategy of obstructionism. So some conclusions and observations. First, since 1994, the power of the majority party and the power that rests in the hands of its leadership will really define how it pursues its policy agenda. Committee chairs don't hold as much sway over the legislative process. It is very much a party-controlled process where they consider the electoral implications of their actions. Most seats are safe now, which cause the parties to be more homogenous and more polarized, because really changes to the House composition and who controls is really coming down to 10-15% of seats available. As I've touched on before, electoral considerations and proposed policy will outweigh the need to address major policy issues. And then really changes in power will become more dramatic and confrontational until the American electorate clearly sides with one party over the other. As the parties become more polarized, the American electorate becomes more polarized, and each has their own competing visions for how the country should move forward. These shifts will not be met nearly as peacefully as they previously had been. You also take into consideration another thing you need to take in consideration here is the idea of how the presidency ultimately will influence the makeup of the House. As House races become less focused on the candidate and they become more nationalized in their direction, where parties can kind of set national agenda and national moods, will affect the composition of the House. If a president is unpopular, it can result in a changing of power. You saw that in 2006. You saw that certainly to a certain extent in 96, where President Clinton was popular, so the Republicans lost seat. In 98, he bucked the trend of losing seats because the Republicans were seen as unpopular. In 2010, despite being a popular president, his policies and the Democrats were unpopular with the American people. So policy prescriptions and presidential policy prescriptions and presidential popularity will certainly play a role in the shifts in Congress moving forward.